Okay, well, here we are. It's been a couple of years since I made one of these talks. And we have arrived at the center of the 8 gates, the center of the mandala of the chakras in any case, because the 4th gate of freedom, which is compassion in this system, is also where the 8th gate is. In general, the 8th gate is also associated with the center. So structurally speaking, we're in the middle. And the heart is the heart of the energy system, not surprisingly. And that's why we use the term heart as a synonym for the center, middle, and so forth. It's in our language, it's in our thinking. And of course, it's the center of the physical heart, it's the center of the blood circulation. Now it's understood, though, that the heart isn't exactly a pump. It's really the pumping happens through this complex, throughout all of the vessels, that there's like a smooth muscle kind of thing that happens. It's not exactly that it's a pump, but it's definitely the center of the blood circulation. And it's also the center of our emotional being. When we think about our heart, it hit me in the heart. This is the center of, where my heart's heavy, things like that. We'll talk about that a little bit more here. And in its highest sense, it's also the source and the substance of all things in the secret center. But we're not quite there yet. I leave that subject really for the 8th gate. To me, there's so many layers of the heart that we have to pass through the heart many times in order to really open all of the gates here. And what I'm talking about today is the heart of compassion. And when we do eventually get to the 8th gate, all of the secrets will be revealed and I won't have anything else to say. So I'm going to hold your breath. For now, we're at the 4th gate. And the 4th gate is about calling us home. It's the summons. It brings us to the center, and that's towards our true nature. So you could say it's the guiding light, or the clarion call, the beckoning. These are all ways that I think of the heart of compassion. It's also the aspiration, the spiritual intention, the prime directive. And I'm speaking about the compassionate response to suffering that is the key to all higher realms, all true transformation, and all sacred endeavors. So it's truly, once we reach the heart, we are beginning to transform spiritually. And it's calling us forward that way. So I'm going to speak about the heart in several levels, as I do with these talks. And we're going to start with the cosmological, and then we'll move on to what we call the external layer of, we're beginning to talk about the key of this compassion, how that works in our spiritual path and our life path and so forth. We'll start with an external layer and then an internal layer, and then eventually we'll discuss a little bit about non-duality, direct pointing. So in the cosmological level, the universe is often described as a play of energy. In Sanskrit, they use the term Shakti. Coming into form and dancing through time, always in divine symmetry. Remember, we talked about symmetry when we talked about the gate of balance, the 2nd gate. And as we discussed then with the gate of balance, the symmetry takes the form of play of opposites. So there's something that doesn't manifest, and that's what they call Shiva. Shiva being the principle of consciousness itself, consciousness without a subject or an object. From this ground of consciousness arises form, emptiness and form, like in the Heart Sutra, and in Buddhist philosophy. But each of the mystical traditions has their own version of this. So, in any case, as things come into form, there's a symmetry to them. Remember we discussed how originally there's a sort of a single, especially when we were talking about embryological development, there's a single, in the gate of balance, there's a single something that happens. I can't even say it. You know, in the Bible, in Genesis, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, right? And so, actually, in the beginning, the Word was with God, something like that, if you actually look at the original Greek. So, this Word is this original Shakti. So it separates, and it takes the form of opposites. And in the manifest universe, we can describe them using the very convenient and clever system of yin and yang, which is from Chinese cosmology, to show how everything does play out in the one way of looking at it, again, is this binary. So you have day and night, masculine, feminine, right? And then when we start to come on with our own judging mind, we divide things into good and bad, pleasure and pain, right? This is part of our mental overlay. And there's so many of these pairs. This is not the point of this talk at all, but I want to get to this really key set of dualistic opposites. And this is, in one sense, you could say, and again, of course, everything I say is just an attempt to point at something beyond words. But one way you can think about it is that the deepest symmetry in the universe is the dance of suffering and grace, of delusion and liberation. That there's this deep, deep dance that the universe enters into, or cosmos, not even universe, beyond universe. Universe is such a materialist concept. The whole of creation, the whole of manifestation, comes into being as a play of veiling, what they call veiling in the Hindu tradition, and grace, which is the unveiling. So there's this quality that we are born into delusion, and yet our true nature of freedom is always there, and through grace we are called back to that true nature. Now again, even this distinction is ultimately imaginary, but it's something that's so key to our experience as humans and as spiritual seekers that I think it's really worth paying attention to. So, what is compassion in that case? Compassion is the intuition of the potential for liberation. It's the intuition of the potential for happiness. In the recognition, in the real recognition of its absence, of the absence of happiness, in the face of sorrow, despair, greed, hatred, and all the rest, all the flavors of human suffering. Within that experience of suffering, the intuition of happiness, somehow there's a knowledge, there's a calling towards that grace, like I said, it's calling us home, of the potential for happiness. And that's what compassion is. So compassion, you see compassion is beginning to get really to the heart of the spiritual problem here, the spiritual path. And that's why it's so key. And that's why it's so important that we take compassion as our prime directive, right? Even though we take these 10 precepts, and on retreat we have, 5 others, all of the precepts, there's a precept 0. And this is what Joel calls the prime directive, like the Starship Enterprise going through the galaxy, and the prime directive was they weren't supposed to interfere with other civilizations or something like that. Well, our prime directive is love and compassion, and this is true for all spiritual secrets. If it's truly a mystical path leading to liberation, this is the case, because it's recognizing that within the suffering there's a potential for happiness. Okay. One way you could say it, in short, is that compassion sees unhappiness and says, I've been there. I know that. And there's another way. Not necessarily another thing to do, another action, another orientation, but that there is the possibility of happiness. So this manifests through us as beings, as human beings, but it is a part of the design of the cosmos. This is cosmological. Delusion is built into the cosmos, so is liberation. Liberation is the reality, because remember, what is arising is coming out of the formless, non-dual consciousness. That's their true nature. That is timeless, immortal, and is blissful. The awareness of being, of true being, is bliss. So it's only the ego that identifies with the separation, with the body-mind complex, you could say, and the story and all that, that becomes this sort of barrier or a filter to that blissful nature, and which is this non-dual state that's at the root. And so, so of course compassion has lots of kind of layers to it. You can have compassion without knowing anything about enlightenment, without knowing anything about non-duality, without knowing anything about your true being nature. But just the intuition that you know that happiness is possible. See, this is the thing. This is why the spiritual path isn't really something that's just for spiritual people. Everybody intuits that happiness is possible. Everybody wants to be happy. And all religions, if they're serving as they were intended by their founders, who are mystics, almost without exception, are trying to help people be happy. That's what we're about. So, you can say that we're created to experience delusion and eventually to wake up. And this is, like I said, because we're already one with the underlying, you could say the creator, if you want to use a theistic term, or the infinite numinous ground of being, if you prefer a non-theistic term. And we're destined to return to awareness of this oneness. It's inevitable. Might take a while in time, but it's inevitable. So, but the problem is we experience dualism, and we suffer greatly from the desires and fears that propel us, seemingly, as individual beings. So the heart feels this. The heart feels this as a disturbance in the vibrations of the serenity of being. There's like a, when children, my kids, if I push my dog with my foot, get out of my way, dog, and the dog's like, huh? And my kids are like, you kicked the dog. I didn't kick the dog, he's fine, I promise. No, I didn't hurt him. But they feel that, there's a little disturbance there. He used his foot, violence. And so we all have this. We all have this sensitivity to suffering. And it was a good sign that your kids don't want you to kick the dog. It means they have good hearts, right? Maybe better than mine. I don't kick the dog. So we feel this vibration. And this response, this natural response, it's like a tuning fork. If you place two tuning forks next to each other, and you hit one and you place them next to the other one will start to vibrate. So it's a compassionate responsiveness. It's a resonance with this disturbance of the serenity of being. So you get the analogy a little bit? Kind of feel that? So, therefore, the key, which in the previous talks I was calling the practice, but now I'm changing the terminology a little bit. It's my prerogative, my system. I'm going to call it the key. Because there's many practices, not just one practice. But the key to all of the practices and to understanding the gate of compassion, the fourth gate, is to respond to suffering. To respond to suffering. It's a response. A response to suffering is a mammalian trait. This is what makes people love their dogs and cats, especially their dogs. Because sometimes you're not sure the cat loves you back. So some people are convinced their cat loves them, some people aren't so sure. But almost everybody thinks their dog loves them, right? Unless they were a very bad dog owner. Because the pets respond to our suffering. Our dog, Sokka, he'll come, if you're upset, he'll come and he'll put his head on your lap. Just puts it there. He kind of looks at me like this, right? And, it makes you feel better, So he instinctively knows that you can use a little support. This is responding to suffering. This is why we love our pets. Their hearts work. Not so much with the reptiles, although I know a lot of people that really felt a lot of love for the reptiles. So they responded to the reptiles. Not so sure the reptiles reciprocated, I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, but for sure it's a mammalian trait. All mammals respond to suffering. It's part of what we now know as the social nervous system. This is cutting edge neuroscience. We call it the triune brain. So we have an autonomic nervous system that consists of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branches. And the parasympathetic is our rest and digest. The sympathetic is our get up and go, or if need to be, our fight and flight. Well, the social nervous system is our tend and befriend. Tend and befriend. And it's all about the heart connecting the face, the facial expression, the throat, our organs of speech, communication. So how we are with others, with other beings, this is a part of our hardwiring as mammals. So the fourth gate in this compassion, which is key to the spiritual path, is something that you can find in all animals. This is why, although most Eastern traditions maintained in their orthodoxy that only human beings can attain enlightenment, Ramana Maharshi, the great Hindu sage of the 20th century, he said that's not true, actually. He says it's, of course, more common for humans to attain enlightenment, but it's possible for animals too. And he had a cow named Lakshmi that he claimed was enlightened. And they built this samadhi shrine to this cow after the cow died. And actually, the only two people that he verbally ever confirmed as attaining liberation were his mother and his cow. So it was a high bar,
In that order?
I think his mom died first. I'm not sure who died first. It was after they died. I'll tell the mom story some other time. Okay. So this is related to aspects of the vagus nerve that innervates the heart, like I said, the heart, throat, avenues of speech expression. And it's about how we can communicate how we're feeling. And that includes our good feelings, but also our suffering. So, in a general sense, getting more to what it's about for humans, the fourth gate is about emotions and about the varieties of the human emotional experience, which is vast and many-layered and interesting. I mean, to us as humans, we find it interesting. And so much of our time is about experiencing and communicating how we feel. It's a big part of our life. And if people don't have a lot going on, then they like to watch TV and have the television drama or story elicit feelings. Joel likes to talk about how that's the job. He was in Hollywood, and the whole point, they'd get together as producers and they would talk about manufacturing an emotional state in the audience. It's about that's what you want to do. And why is that? Because it's such a big part of our identity. So, but this also builds upon what we've studied so far, the first three gates. And we begin with the first gate, with our primary needs. Are we safe? Are we loved? Are we nourished? At the second gate, we have our secondary needs. Is there lust or disgust? Is there pleasure or pain? At the third gate, we express ourselves and how our needs are being met. Are we angry? What else do we want? How do we move in life? Are we frustrated? Are we resenting what's going on? So at the fourth gate, we get a lot more complicated. Are we sad? Are we lonely? Are we jealous? Who do we love? Who loves us? What makes our hearts sing? What brings us happiness, bliss, right? So not just movies, but all poetry, if it's good, touches on the display of feelings that arise in the heart. And good literature, of course. So the spectrum of bliss through suffering, you say there's this spectrum of the heart that is awakened and turned towards its source, completely at peace, all through all of the different hues of that not being quite the case, down to the deepest depths of despair and eternal damnation, right? Because it feels like eternity when you're there. These are infinite hues. You can't really say how many, right? These varieties are worked upon the canvas of the heart. This is the artistry of that primary pair of opposites, delusion and grace. And through all of the hues of that, like this says in the Tao Te Ching, from the two comes the three, and from the three the myriad things, meaning many, many things. Often translated as 10,000, because that was the biggest number they had in Chinese back then. But it really just means the myriad, the many, many things. So all of these hues of our experiences of suffering and happiness display in them. So again, the key to unlocking the mystery of the fourth gate of freedom, compassion, is to respond to suffering. And I'm going to talk about external, internal, and non-dual levels of this gate. So until now, this was sort of an introduction. Are there any questions? People following me? Generally nodding. Okay.
Can we turn the lights up again a little bit? Because it seems a little dim.
Sure. Would you mind going and turning the lights up?
I'm not turning them
Just a tad. They are slightly dim. That's good. Okay. So the first level, the external, begins with our mother, or our primary caregiver. For most of us, it's a mother. It could be a father. It could be I don't know, some people might have been raised by wolves. It could have been a wolf. But our primary caregiver, responding to our cries. So our bum is wet, or we're hungry, or we're tired. So we scream. Mom comes, checks our bum, gives us the boobie, or rocks us to sleep. If this happens most of the time, we grow up well-adjusted because our suffering has been responded to. And remember, this forms the foundation of love, the first gate. This is our sense of being loved and feeling safe. And then we begin to develop faith that even though we suffer some, it won't last that long, and the world has good in it. So that we begin to, as we're developing love, compassion is also being expressed, and so we're feeling the response of compassion. So they really go together a lot. All of the gates, of course, blend into each other, but there's a real connection between love and compassion, obviously. On the other hand, for those who were neglected or abused, then the fourth gate does not develop so well. And this, of course, would, like I say, go along with problems in the first gate when love is lacking. But people can become jaded that there is any good in the world. And if that's the case, these people can become cold and calculating and cynical. And this category would include sociopaths, where they don't know how to respond to suffering. People that have become so cut off from their social nervous system that there's a real disconnect, and they don't understand, they don't have an experience of it. Or people may find it difficult if they've had some lack of this support, some neglect or abuse, might find it difficult to respond to their own suffering. And in this case, they might feel deep down that they're worthless and unworthy. And this would go along with the lack of self-love, the lack of that foundation, but also a inability to respond with compassion to themselves. Or the third general trend that I've seen is that they might become manipulators, putting on a show of suffering in order to get empathy, during which time they can convince people to do things for them. And this would be people who, could be diagnosed as borderline personality disorder. So that's when things go wrong, just to mention it. But let's assume there was compassion for us as children, enough compassion. And we learn to recognize what suffering is. And then we learn what compassion is. So we hate to see animals suffer, unlike a sociopath, who probably would feel one way or the other. And we can identify with the trials and tribulations of characters in cartoons and movies. I remember when my kids were really young, and some cartoons would really scare them because it was scary. Because that, the bad guy was going to get the good guy, and we like the good guy. We don't want the good guy to suffer. It's scary because that bad guy's really scary, right? That's compassion. They're identifying with the character. They're finding, that they can feel the suffering of the character. We want the main character to find happiness and avoid tragedy. We want a happy ending. So in the external level of responding to suffering, we begin to sense into the suffering of others and respond with compassion. We might see it in our little toddler friends first, and kiss their boo-boos. I've seen that. There was someone on Facebook of a little kid, kissing a little friend, and she had a little knee thing or something. Because that's what we do with our kids, and then they do the same thing, right? And then as we get a little bit older, we'll see it in the world. We see suffering in the world, and we learn about poverty and homelessness and environmental degradation, and we feel aghast at the mass of suffering in the world. Why have all the adults allowed this to go on? Why have they let it become so screwed up, right? Do you remember feeling that way when you were younger? It's like, how did this happen? I thought the world was just, cartoons and lollipops. Now I know it's not. It's terrible. And then as we get older, we begin to have close friends and loved ones, and we see suffering in them and we respond with compassion to them. I remember when I was first in college, just like the first few months I was out of the house, and I really started to realize how much others around me were suffering. And I remember there was this girl I knew in college. She was, a poor rich girl. I mean, she didn't have it that hard, is what I mean. She was from a wealthy family, very attractive, if I recall correctly. But she just wanted to share all of her burdens with me, and I found it really touching my heart. Of course, she didn't want to date me. She just wanted to tell me about all these frat boys that weren't treating her right. But that's okay. It was kind of what started me on, I actually don't mind listening to other people. Because there's something about opening your heart, right? And that's part of what got me on the path of the healer and my particular version of the spiritual path. There's many others, of course. So some of us feel very strongly about helping others and might enter the social sphere as activists, social interest lawyers, healers, or even politicians. I mean, I'm sure that some of them have. I really like Tulsi Gabbard, for instance. I think she's in it for the good, for the good of the whole, for the right reasons. So in that case, we'll take an active interest in the suffering of the world. Okay. So where was I? Oh, okay. So I mentioned that, some people take an active interest in the world's suffering and make it a practice to try to be engaged. In Buddhism, there's a movement spearheaded by Romy, my wife Romy's teacher, Joan Halifax, among others, socially engaged Buddhism. So taking the Buddhist principles of compassion and nonviolence and meditation and mindfulness and understanding the causes of suffering into the social sphere, which is kind of a Western, kind of comes from some of the better traits of Christianity of trying to help the poor and that kind of. Some people, though, just ignore the world's suffering. They become aware of it and then feel that maybe it's too much to bear, or they have enough of their own, or maybe they just simply haven't been really exposed to it. They're not really quite aware of the extent of the suffering of the world. I think most of us, at least in the circles I run in, probably try to keep informed, vote, stay aware of the plights of the world, feeling that this is the least that we can do. I know Dr. Wolf, he felt that it was his responsibility as a sage, somebody that knows the truth, to at least watch the evening news. So, every evening, you watch the 5:30 news, whatever, the half-an-hour news hour.
So is that where Joel got that?
Might be where Joel got
Yeah.
that habit, yeah.
I think it's also my father and uncle, and it's just part of, it seems like sort of part of a generation.
My folks used to always do that. I don't know if they still do it. But then there are people who are living in the middle of suffering, in the middle of extreme poverty or homelessness or war zones and so forth. And they're in a different category altogether. They're in the middle of surviving. And they're in the middle of suffering, and they'll likely carry trauma forward to be healed at a later date. But even so, it's very common to see people who are in this survival situation really acting with compassion, really coming and responding to suffering and saving others. And like Romy, she went on that street retreat, and the homeless people that had nothing were offering her all sorts of things. So there are a lot of ways people begin to respond to suffering externally. And the question is, are we beginning to recognize that it's there? Are we beginning to be open to it? And the point isn't, are we fixing everything in the world? The point of recognizing suffering in the world is to see that it is something significant. It's happening. It's the reality. This is the reality, folks. Being suffering. That's why it's the first noble truth in Buddhism. The truth of suffering. Until you recognize suffering exists, you can't pass beyond to wondering what to do about it. If you think, well, it's okay, then you can't continue. Which brings us to the next category, the internal category of responding to suffering, of the fourth gate. And this comes when we recognize the universality of suffering. This begins, I should say, the beginning of really making this inward plunge. Because the truth is that suffering is impersonal, as is liberation. There is no separate self that suffers. In truth, the ultimate source of suffering is clinging to a separate self. So it might be useful to make a distinction here. Circumstances dictate the form of suffering, but the essence is always clinging. So you say circumstances are the conditions. Conditions for suffering change, and conditions can make suffering more likely or less likely, but they cannot cause suffering. Clinging is the cause. So this is again in the Noble Truths, the truth of the cause of suffering in Buddhism. Another way that this is sometimes put, it's a little cliche, but I think is pretty apt if you understand what it means, is that pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. somewhat of a platitude, but it contains this truth, right? That it's through clinging and releasing the clinging that we begin to become free of our suffering. By recognizing the clinging and releasing. So if we're having, for instance, physical pain, we can stub our toe. And we can go, oh, God darn it, I stubbed my toe, it hurts so bad. And then we can go, wait a minute, I'm a meditator, I'm gonna practice mindfulness. And then I'll be, okay, what does that actually feel like? Well, there's kind of hot, like a kind of a pulsing, kind of a tingling, kind of a throbbing pulse. It's always changing, the sensation is never quite the same, and now it's starting to diminish. And without pushing, if I can be present with the sensation without pushing it away, there's no suffering. It's relatively easy to do with the toe. It's a lot harder to do when your life's on the line. Right? But possible. This is where the path leads, in any case. So, as we begin to recognize the universality of suffering, we also begin to see that the cause of suffering is not in the conditions. It's not in economics, or resource wars, or crooked politicians. These are just conditions for suffering. Some of them make it more likely. Equally, you can say that happiness is not in a full belly, a good night's sleep. You get where I'm going? It's not in getting what you want, avoiding what you don't want. That's not actually where happiness lies. So as we begin to become clear about the truth of suffering, we begin to intuit, reverse the truth of happiness. The happiness isn't going to come from changing my circumstance. So, this goes further. And we've got to go there because it's important to really be clear here. The source of suffering is not even in such horrible things that people do to each other as slavery or cold-blooded murder, right? These are terrible things. But the source of suffering is in the clinging. In the person who's suffering more? The person who was killed or the person who was killed, who has done the killing? The person who's done the killing is still around to suffer. The person who has passed beyond the veil, well, it's hard to say. Maybe they went to hell because they were a terrible person and they're suffering really bad too. Most likely not. Most likely that they're going, whoa, that was terrible, and I feel bad for all my friends. They're suffering. We don't need to go there. But the point is, it's the clinging. So we can start to have compassion for people who do evil. So these kinds of crimes are heinous, but they only perpetuate negative conditioning. And this could probably be for a very long time. But they do not create the core of identification. They don't create delusion. Delusion was already there. The source of suffering is within our hearts, each of us. Our identification as separate is the essence of suffering. And this is a really deep thing. It's not a superficial thing. You know, we talk a lot about letting go of thoughts, letting go of story, and so forth. And that is very important. And what happens when you let go of thoughts and you let go of story is that you start to get deeper into the energy of the conditioning. The energy of that raw unhappiness, suffering, feeling separate. All of those deeper layers. The thoughts keep us distracted. So the ego isn't just the thought that I am the body-mind. It's the conviction that I am the body-mind, or that I'm limited to the body-mind is a better way of putting it. Because of course you're the body-mind, but you're just also everything else. So we recognize, as we progress in this way, that in order to be free from suffering, we must transform our heart. And the same goes for everyone. So this is when we start to realize, wow, you know, social services are great, but it's never going to solve the problem. Politics are great, necessary even, but it's never going to solve the problem. What is required is a transformation in our heart. And that goes for everyone. So hopefully our social services and our politics and so forth can help serve for people's heart transformations. That's what we'd like. And our education system, that would be fantastic. And our healthcare system, that would be even better, right? Because this is where it's at. It's not in the circumstances. The circumstances, of course, are useful. Some of the happiest people on the planet live in Bhutan, which is one of the poorest countries on the planet. Okay. Where was I? So, when we really take this on, when we really recognize this, that our suffering comes from clinging, then we take a truly massive turn in our understanding of suffering, in our understanding of our path and of our purpose here. And we come to no longer fear suffering. Because we realize that our suffering is our guide to our clinging. It's the bobber in our fishing line telling us to reel it in. Something is on the hook. It's one of Joel's classical analogies. Something's on the hook. What's on the hook? Be curious. If we're curious, then we might find out. Then we might be able to let go. So we begin to become more and more sensitive to our own suffering, to our own conditioning, and begin to become more and more aware of our moment-to-moment resistance to life, which is a part of that clinging, that resistance is clinging. There's a couple different terms, right, for this. Clinging, resistance, holding on, pushing away, it's all the same. And what does it do? It creates suffering. So it's not really different, it's just that suffering and clinging really, it's like two sides of the same coin. We also begin to become more sensitive to others' suffering by realizing that suffering is impersonal, it is universal. It becomes less ominous, less daunting, and our heart grows to accommodate the woes of the world, to take them in, to transform them, and to beam out love and compassion. What Joel says, and I've heard Gangaji say the same thing, is we want to let our hearts break all the way open. And if they break all the way open, so they're broke open, it broke. You can't put it back together. Then that's freedom, actually. It seems counterintuitive, but it's that putting it back together and that identifying again, the clinging. That's the problem. So, in that realm of learning to open our hearts to the world, I think the Tibetan Buddhist practice of Tonglen, of sending and taking, really epitomizes this turnabout into understanding of suffering. And so, before we get to the final chapter here, I want to briefly discuss a little bit about Tonglen. Has everybody done Tonglen? Anybody not done it? Not done it, okay. So, there are some traditional mystical quotes here that I'm going to just mention that epitomize sort of this attitude. In the Metta Sutta, the Loving Kindness Sutra, the Buddha says, even as a mother protects with her life her child, her only child, so with a boundless heart should one cherish all living beings, radiating kindness over the entire world. And the kind of the essence of this attitude is in the Bodhisattva vow, which has different versions. But the Bodhisattva vow comes from Mahayana Buddhism, and where from the older, they call it Theravada, or the Hinayana, the older school, they added a kind of significant difference in that they took on this Bodhisattva ideal, which is this idea that we are practicing to alleviate the suffering of all of the beings of the world. And sometimes it's sort of seen as you're waiting to go into nirvana until everybody's in nirvana. It's, you know, sort of kind of holding out. That's sort of a lower level understanding of it. The higher level, they start to admit, well, actually, there aren't other sentient beings, but it's the attitude that's the key. It's the attitude begins to open us up to suffering. So Dr. Wolf, Joel's teacher, had a version that he would hand out. He would have it on a little card, and anytime somebody came to visit him, he would give them the card, and he would say, "It's not required, but I highly recommend it." And his version was, "Never shall I seek nor receive private individual salvation, but forever and everywhere shall I live and strive for the redemption of every creature throughout the world." So it's that idea of, oh, I missed one part. Never will I strive for private individual salvation, never enter into the final peace alone. That's the key there. But forever and everywhere will I live and strive for the redemption of all creatures throughout the world. So that was his thing. And it was really important on his path. Just prior to his final liberation, his final complete enlightenment, there was this experience of such sublime bliss, of unity, of nirvanic consciousness. And it was really tempting to basically just leave the body. And his wife said, "What about everybody else?" And she kind of called him back and reminded him of this compassionate aspect. And that helped him break through to what he called the high indifference, where the world and all the suffering in the world in nirvana and nirvanic consciousness are seen as two sides of the same coin. And so there's this profound equanimity and a complete liberation. And then he was able to live to be 98 years old. He didn't just, vanish into the ethers in his early 50s. So, in sending and taking, what you do is, and we're not going to practice it right now, but we're going to start practicing it. But I just want to put this into the talk so that people who are listening to this talk haven't heard of sending and taking, which is Tonglen in Tibetan, understand what it is. And what you do is you start by meditating, getting some stability, and then you have to open up to a spacious awareness. It's a key here that we have a spacious awareness. So this is what we do is choiceless awareness. We relax all effort into this vast spaciousness. So we'll assume we're all in a vast spaciousness. Then at this point, what we do is we can do sending and taking for ourselves, for our own suffering. We can do it for people that we're friendly with, that we know are suffering. We can do it for people that, in general out in the world that we don't know, but we know, like, the starving children in Africa or, what have you, the Syrian refugees. And that's very good. The highest level, though, of sending and taking is for our enemies, for the people that we feel have harmed us the most. And this is because this is where our clinging is the most. You see? Because we talked about what is suffering. Suffering is clinging. So when we find the best practice is always going to be where our clinging is the most. And that's also generally where we're blindest. And anger makes us pretty blind. So when the Dalai Lama was asked once by an interviewer, who was your greatest guru? He said, Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong, of course, was the chairman Mao, the leader of the People's Republic of China for, 50 years, from the beginning of the communist era up until, the late 70s or something, when he died in his 80s. And he was responsible for the invasion of Tibet and all of the horrific things that happened there, and the Dalai Lama's eventual, he had to flee, and the persecution of all the nuns and monks and so forth, right? So you can't really think of a worse person from the perspective of the Dalai Lama. He's pretty bad. It's sort of like somebody whose entire family was wiped out by the Third Reich, saying that who was your best spiritual teacher was Hitler. It's the same thing. Maybe that's even a little bit more extreme, because Hitler actually probably killed more Jews than Mao killed Tibetans. But Mao killed like 30 million people, so he's a bad guy. Anyway, the point is, that's the highest level. So if you don't have to initially go there right away. Start with yourself, or somebody you really care about is even easier maybe. and focus on the person's suffering. Try to vividly bring to mind, as clearly as possible, what makes them both human, lovable, and vulnerable, and then focus on their suffering and what makes them suffering. You know, the physical, mental, emotional, what they're experiencing, and so forth. And really come up with the story so that you elicit in your own experience your heart beginning to feel, you know, that vibration, that responsiveness to compassion to the suffering. And then you vow, may this person be relieved of all their anguish and pain. And then you breathe in, the next part is you visualize, you breathe in their love and their suffering like it's black smoke into your heart. And your heart becomes this vast space of light where it's transformed, and then you breathe out love and compassion like light, clear, radiant white light. And if you're doing it to yourself, it's to all the cells in your body. If you're doing it to others, you visualize it. You can visualize. If you can't visualize, just try to focus on the suffering and the compassion. And at first it's a clunky exercise, but eventually it becomes very natural. And at the end, now one key here is you're very spacious, right? And so you're able to allow that suffering feeling to completely dissolve. And if it's about yourself, you drop the story. You just feel your own suffering, and then you let it dissolve into your heart space. And then when you're breathing out, it's light, the light of love and compassion. So it becomes very natural. You synchronize it with your breaths, and this becomes a practice that you can turn to anytime there's suffering. So what it does is it starts to train you as a spiritual practitioner. When you hear about something that's terrible, instead of resisting and clenching and tightening and clinging and feeling worse, you let the suffering in. You let your heart open. Remember, Joel says, let your heart break wide open. And you begin to feel more compassion. You become more available. This does not mean being if somebody's saying something mean to you, you just start going, oh, I'm just going to do something and taking for this person. You still have to respond skillfully in the moment to what's going on around you. But when you hear about suffering, or if somebody tells you about their suffering, this begins to become a very natural way that you can respond. That helps your spiritual practice. So that's sitting and taking. Does anybody have any questions on sitting and taking?
Yeah.
Yeah, Becky.
So when I think about people that are suffering in my social circle, especially the people, not a lot of people at work, that I know they're suffering, but they don't know. I mean, I encounter people that are greedy, that are closed off in their hearts and in their minds, and that's their way. They basically have a closed off heart, and I know they do it because they're suffering for some other reason. How do I do Tonglen for them? May your heart be open. They're pursuing their dreams, they're doing the things they do, but I know there's the background behind what they're doing is suffering.
Well, so you don't really know
Yeah,
exactly how they're suffering.
yes,
You can see maybe the signs,
yes.
and because we begin to learn that suffering is universal, we can be pretty sure that almost everybody has some suffering. So you don't have to necessarily know exactly what's going on for somebody to wish them happiness.
Mhm.
You don't have to wish them the mechanism of their happiness. I wish that you would stop being such a stubborn SOB and begin to, recognize feminist politics as sensible. That's not what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
What we're actually interested in is to feel our heart expand.
Mhm.
And so in the beginning, it really seems like a very other-oriented practice. But again, this sense of I and other is an illusion. And so what it really begins to become is a very useful practice for our own path. It begins to expand our sense of identity. So even these people that are so miserable, they don't even know they're suffering, they're causing all the suffering for other people, and they're completely closed off to it, even them, you have room in your heart for them. So much of Jesus' teachings were about this kind of thing, turn the other cheek. The man walks a mile, walk with you, walk whatever, 5 miles or whatever he said with him. You know, man asks you for, you know, coat off your back, give him your shoes or whatever he said. You know, this kind of thing. This is about opening your heart. It's about being selfless. Is it over here? No. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So we're going to move along here and try to get it all in the second round on the video recorder. The final category of the fourth gate of freedom is the non-dual. And I call this boundless compassion. I, of course, did not coin that term, but I love it, and we're going to use it. So beyond personal suffering, the awakened heart is as vast as the universe. When we're cultivating our spacious awareness, we're cultivating this vast heart. Knowing separation to be an illusion, we realize that all is my body. All is myself. That non-dual consciousness is in everything. Everything is arising from it. We begin to at first in glimpses and later stably, and then eventually ego is shattered. It's a dream. There's nothing to it. It's something that is a combination of thought and habit, energy habit. And when it's seen through, the separation is gone.
You need to hurry up because I got this.
So fearlessly, without effort or struggle, the life force moves as it will, by the dictates of nature and, you could say, the refined destiny of accumulated good conditioning of a life devoted to passion. In Tibetan, they say, in Tibetan Buddhism, they say that you want to cultivate the twofold accumulations. The first is good karma. Don't want bad karma because it makes it hard to practice. It makes it bad. I mean, it's negative. It's not good for you. It sends you to the wrong place. You don't want it. You want good karma. But good karma by itself won't get you free. You have to see through the doer, through the separate self. So the first accumulation is the good karma, good conditioning, and that gets you a higher position in samsara. Better, food on the table, a place to sleep. This is good, right? But the second of the accumulations is wisdom, insight, realization. We don't know what's going to happen. Caring what is happening, caring about suffering, and responding in the moment, letting go of what might happen. That's freedom. That's a free heart. We cannot control what's going to happen. All we can do is respond to what's happening. I mean, it's so obvious. It's like, right? But to live that way, imagine, it's a lot easier. For no matter what suffering arises in the world, in our friends, in our loved ones, we know that our heart is vast enough to accommodate it all. And nobody is excluded from this warmth, this embrace of this boundless compassion. It's identical with the space. We feel others' pain resonate within our hearts. We feel it. But because we don't resist those reverberations, these echoes that recall to memory our own past hurts, they don't stick to us. We can respond freely. We see them for what they are. So you could say lingering pulsations of a mind stream yet attached to distinctions, to thoughts, to separation in all its forms. It's the ripples on the pond. It's still water. So, where was I here? So I said, nobody is excluded from this boundless compassion because we identify with everyone. And we resonate with their pain. But we don't resist that resonation. We don't resist those echoes. You could say that the pain is like eddies in the current of one vast supreme being that is our heart. It's our core, it's our own. So the pain is in us. And so like a mother, like we were talking about earlier, tending to the squalling infant, we minister to the cares of those who come to us, swaddling or burping them as we intuit proper. Of course, the skillful means are necessary. It's not like you just necessarily know how to help, but it's just a response, natural. We don't have to see it as something overwhelming. It doesn't necessarily overwhelm us anymore. And through time, we become more adept at this intuition, this natural compassionate responsiveness. We learn the ins and outs of the complexity of people's cares and worries and gain insight into the subtleties of clinging. Because the ego is very sneaky. And it can be very, everybody's different, and it can be kind of confusing to try to help people because they respond differently from others. But we recognize our own heart in all, and all are seen as an expression of our heart. This is true whether we're very active in the world or reclusive. Our heart continually resonates from the deep core of wordless knowing. It's the boundless compassion of awakening upon the world. So that's the non-dual level, little pointer. Any final questions before we wrap this evening up? All right. Well, until next time, peace to you all.